Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie and today I'm going to talk about the books that I've read in May and June. I have made a couple videos where I do talk about, I don't think all of the books, but most of these books to various degrees of depth. So some of these I'm just going to go through quickly because and then I'll link in the description box and also in the cards videos where I've talked more in depth about each book. The first thing I read was actually a short story by P. Djeli Clark in the Dead Djinn universe, which is what A Master of Djinn is part of, which I read in April, and that's The Angel of Khan el-Khalili, and yeah, I enjoyed it. I think I do prefer like longer works in that world because I just really love it as a setting, and you know, short stories don't give you that much space for like actually really being weighted in the world, but it was enjoyable and it made me, you know, want to keep reading in that series for sure. I also think I might reread A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which is the first one I think in the series, soon. So yeah. The next two books I read I have spoken about in a wrap-up for Springathon, and that's Terra Nullius by Claire G. Coleman and The Gracekeepers by Kirsty Logan, and I enjoyed both of these a lot. I think I did prefer this one just because it's like less horrendously violent, but I think this is a really incredible piece of like literary science fiction, so I would recommend both of them. The next book I read was a non-fiction book called Constellations by Sinead Gleeson, which I sent back to my friend who lent it to me, finally. I guess I was like somewhat disappointed in this book. I had heard really great things, and I think I just ended up feeling like it was a little bit, maybe simplistic is the best way to put it. I did also find that, like, you know, this does talk about grief, sickness, bodies, and as a result I think I did feel some kind of like resentment towards it for trying to get me to feel like grief feelings basically, and I don't, you know, that's not totally fair in terms of like the book itself or what the author was doing. But yeah, I think the places where it worked the best was when Sinead Gleeson is talking about art. I thought that was nice, and threaded throughout is this very intense exploration of what it's like to be sick, a sick woman, a sick girl in Ireland, but obviously a lot of those experiences are very relatable. Yeah, like the experience of that and mothering as well. I definitely did speak a little bit about this in my TBR jar for May wrap-up, but I definitely felt like the essay about abortion and repealing the 8th Amendment in Ireland was really great and very emotional. And I also really enjoyed like this one about like artistic wounds and light, and Frida Kahlo, and that was also a very successful piece for me. So it wasn't completely disappointing, it just, I thought that I was gonna have like a really cohesive experience with it, and I didn't in the way that I thought I would, but that's okay, you know. The next book I read was Dead Collections by Isaac Fellman, which I have spoken a little bit about in 2 videos actually. I did say I would speak more about it now, but I'm not sure if I will. This is a fun book about a trans man vampire archivist, and it's quite slight, but it's obviously written by someone who loves the archive. I obviously love vampires and I love archives, so this is also why, and obviously a vampire is a very potent figure of archiving because they're a living dead person, but this book also kind of thinks about that in terms of like vampirism being a sickness, and like I like that dimension. Basically, I guess I thought I would love this more than I did end up loving it. To some degree I think it's just quite like fast because it is quite slight. I read it all in one day, and to some degree it's like a bit surface level, even though it's also is engaged in thinking about gender as like a complex history, one that has an archive, and you know, specifically like trans gender experience, but also just gender itself. To some degree it splits off sexuality as a distinct experience, but it also does connect the two. Struggling to talk about this because I feel like I really don't want people to misconstrue what I disliked about this book, and it's also like a personal response and experience I had with this, which obviously is every book, but you know what I mean. I think that, like, I'm pretty sure Isaac Fellman has experienced archiving, but I do think that there is like a lack of thinking about like the violence of the archive, because there's such like a focus on loving the archive as like a physical space with all of these like objects, and you know, like just enjoying the less sort of grunt work of like, you know, organising and sorting through things and coordinating and working with other archivists. Whilst I really respect that, I do feel like, yeah, there wasn't that much thinking about how the archive can contain and hold and reproduce violence. And in fact I think the book somewhat, I mean, it sounds very like intense when I say it like this, I don't think that it was done maliciously or anything, but I just did feel like one of the characters who begins the book dead and whose partner brings in a box of like her stuff. Yeah, so like Tracy or Trace, like she is a sci-fi author and has died, and yeah, it's like her sort of objects that like catalyze the plot, I guess. And I just didn't really like how the book kind of concluded about like her and her experience, and like, not to say that like maybe she would have been happier if she had realised that she was like a man or that she was trans, or, but I just felt because she wasn't speaking for herself, which obviously is part of the point of archives, but yeah, I don't know, I just felt very uncomfortable about the whole thing because she was stone butch, and obviously there are some people who identify as stone butches because they are not actually stone butch and it's like a sort of crossway identification, but there are obviously lots of stone butchers who are stone butch, and I don't know, and then because she's not a very nice person, it also made me feel like there was just some like negativity about butchers happening. Anyway, moving on. Then I read a completely different book, and that's Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. I really did not enjoy this. We are also getting into the books that I have spoken about in this reading vlog I made of Middlemarch, so I will link that in the description box and in the card. But yeah, like Ruth is basically about this woman who gets pregnant out of wedlock. Oh, I say woman, she's like a teenager, and she gets treated pretty badly, but she gets taken in by a nonconformist minister, parson, I don't remember the terminology, and his sister. And he's actually disabled. I can't really remember how he's described. I think he actually has a deformity which affects his stature, but he's very much like a capital D disabled man who, you know, in part through his worthy suffering is like the most virtuous man in the book. But yeah, so it's about Ruth and her life, and I really did not like it. I do think that Elizabeth Gaskell is really good at creating character. Like, there's a reason why I really hated this book, and one of the reasons is because the characters are very vivid and I did not like them. Not necessarily because they're like unlikable or whatever that means, but just like, I just really, like, I did not enjoy the plot and I did not enjoy the characters. I think that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote a really good book in Wives and Daughters, but I don't think any of her other books are ever gonna be like good for me again. Then I read The Abyss Surrounds Us by Emily Skritsky, which I also talked about in both my Middlemarch and my Springathon wrap-up, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but I did enjoy it, and it was really nice sort of light reading to read alongside PhD application stuff. The next book I read is one of my favourite books of the year, if not the favourite book I read this year, and that's Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi. It's a hard book to talk about because of how sense happens in it, but I also personally felt like a lot of people say that they didn't understand this book but they still loved it or whatever, but I actually feel like, maybe this is a bit silly of me to say, but I actually feel like I understood the book because it speaks to a really deep sense of my own logic, and that's why I loved it so much. Like, this fairy tale sense of like nonsensical meaning, it just makes sense to me. It made sense to me. Like, the world that was made in the pages really made sense, and I just loved it. I really enjoyed it in terms of like its perspective on Europe and sort of like nation and borders and like dream country, nightmare country, return, immigration, food, appetite, all sorts of things. I also loved how it spoke to like mothering and care, and sort of also the very specific experience of like alienated black women and girls of Europe, and yeah, like their place and their sense of fairy tale identity and belonging and family. And yeah, I just loved it a lot, and I'm really excited to reread it as a physical book because I didn't read it as a physical book, I listened to it on audio, but also read more of Helen Oyeyemi's work because I just loved it so much. And I did kind of know I was going to, like, one of my friends actually was like, when, you know, she was reading it years ago, was like, oh, I think you'd really like this book because things just happen and that's like how you exist. And it's true, things do just happen. I exist and I understood. I think it's doing some really interesting things about like Marxist feminism, or like women workers, girl workers, the work of gender itself, and also family abolition, or like diffuse forms of care, maybe some communism in there. Yeah, just loved it a lot. So then I read the selected poems of Anna Akhmatova, translated by D.M. Thomas, and generally I found it to be like an okay experience, but the one collection of poems that I really felt were amazing was Requiem, which is her most famous collection of work, and is about her experience. I think it was written in 1940 or so, but then not actually like written down and published until the 60s or 70s. And she's writing under Stalin and is writing about her experience of having her son taken away from her and her treatment under the Soviet regime, and being a mother trying to connect to and reach her son, and navigating sort of prison bureaucracy, but also just simply a really meaningful sense of being present and being present with people. And yeah, I did think that they were really great. The rest of the sort of selected poems were okay, and I also think that actually had I read a different translation of all of them, I think it would have been better. This was like a recent, as in to when the poems were originally published, translation, and I think, you know, the art of translating has probably developed quite a lot, especially in terms of like Russian language in the past 50 years. Because yeah, I'm pretty sure D.M. Thomas was translating it in the 70s, which obviously is very interesting in terms of the context, because the USSR is still around, even if Stalin, I can't remember when it was like, what, like late 60s, early 70s, anyway. So, you know, that's also a really interesting political context to be reading poetry in critique of Soviet government structure and corruption and violence. I wouldn't necessarily recommend like the whole collection of poems that I read, but I would really recommend Requiem, and it actually more so made me want to read like about Anna Akhmatova's life rather than read more of her poetry. And I know that there is like a biography called like Anna of All the Russians or something, which I am interested in reading, so I will probably keep reading about her, but you know, probably not for a while. The next book I read was On the Landing, stories by Jenta Mash, translated by Ellen Cassidy. This is another book I said I would talk more in depth about, but I'm not sure if I can. Basically, like, I would have still been interested in this if I had like properly known this, but what I didn't quite realise was that Jenta Mash moved to Israel in the 70s and lived there, and then I think that is when she began to write, and even though not all of her stories were about living in Israel, like a chunk of them in this collection, but also that she produced were, and I think if I had known the extent of her connection to Israel, I might not have picked this up. Although, again, we have another book about Soviet history, really difficult Soviet time, but this time focused on the experience of Jewish women and girls generally living in Soviet Moldova until we get like a switch to Israel as the main setting. This collection was picked by, I think, the translator, so it's from like a whole bunch of like Jenta Mash's various different collections, which it is why, you know, there is such like a distinct switch from one set mostly in Bessarabia to one set mostly in Israel. And I don't know entirely how like intentional the curation of these stories was supposed to be, in terms of saying like these people who were displaced in Moldova now get to be like replaced and rehoused in Israel, but that is what it ends up kind of saying, even though living in Israel is part of displacing Palestinian people, which isn't really hinted at in this collection, but except for maybe one single mention of a Palestinian person in one of the stories set in Israel, and he's just a passing comment. His very presence hints at a Palestinian world, at a totally different group of people being centered in the narrative, but yeah, that's just completely not taken up or thought about in any depth, or written about in any more detail whatsoever. Part of me wishes that they had just translated like one of Jenta Mash's first or second collections, which I believe focused solely on short stories about her experience and her community's experience in Bessarabia and being displaced by the Soviets to work camps in Siberia. Is that right? I can't remember. I felt like this was like linguistically really interesting, even in translation, at least like the first sort of 40% of the collection, but I don't know, I just feel very ambivalent about it now, and I definitely wouldn't really recommend this to anybody unless you're reading it for like a very specific reason. There is one particular story that's set in Israel that I couldn't finish because it made me feel really bad, which is about like the Israeli Defense Force and a cap that you wear when you're part of it, and I just hated how much it normalised violence. I'm not sure if I can talk any more about this, so I'm gonna move on. The next book I read was a novella by R.B. Lemberg called The Fall Profound Weaves. I read it for the Queer Lit Readathon, and I did have some other options that maybe I would have liked to read, but I just knew that I could only read one thing because I had like my middle March reading happening, and I also had like some deadlines and blah 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 happening. But again, I have spoken about this in more depth recently, so I'm not going to go into it here. I'm pretty sure I read On the Landing in June, and like that's when my June reading started, which was much less than my May reading in general, but that's okay. Then I read All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews, which was actually one of the choices for my June TBR jar pick, which I decided I'm going to just include my TBR stuff like in wrap-up videos rather than making separate videos about them. But I might make a couple videos of me picking the TBR like on my TikTok, so I will leave that in the description box if you're interested in watching, and then, you know, we can see together if I read any of the ones I pick out. But yeah, so in June, All My Puny Sorrows was one of my choices, which was really good because I wanted to read it whilst I was with my parents, and then I did pick it, so it made it like double whammy. This book is about suicide, so if you want to not listen to that, then go to the bit in the video where I'm next like putting a picture up of a different book next to me. Basically the premise is that there are these two sisters, Elfrida and Yolandi or Yoli, and Yoli is the main character. She's the one who's writing the story, like narrating, and Yoli's sister Elf wants to die and has, I think we begin the book where she has tried to. It's about that, and you learn more about like her family and her relationship with her sisters. I guess it does actually start like, because I did read the first chapter of this for my try chapter tag, and it starts with this like incredible first line about like they watched their house rolling away down the street in 1979 or whatever. I definitely butchered that, and yeah, it's this very vivid, and they're Mennonites, so like they come from a Mennonite community, which is I think quite quintessential for Miriam Toews. Like I haven't read any more of her books, but it seems like most of them are about the experience of being a Mennonite woman to various like degrees or whatever. Anyway, and this book is really incredible. I have personal experience with people who've committed suicide, and I also have my own experience to suicide as like a thing, and so it's, you know, it was pretty upsetting to read at points, and it was also one of the most like relatable and also ultimately I think actually deeply healing things that I've read about suicide, about wanting to die, about caring for people who want to die, about how to live after people have killed themselves, and also how like we all kind of want to kill ourselves but then we don't, and then trying to navigate the liminal space between the desire and the action and just caring for people in a kind of like agonizing, tender way. It really was like an incredible book. I definitely don't feel comfortable kind of suggesting anybody else read it. I think like if you feel drawn to it then it might be great, but also it might just be too much and too close to the bone. That's definitely how I felt at points, but I felt like it was so incredibly, like I don't think I really have ever felt like I've read a book that actually deals with the reality of those experiences in such a real way, and it is because Miriam Toews has experienced, like it felt a bit like Will and Testament by Vigdis Hjort, or yeah, I can't remember. Hjort, thank you. Where, you know, it was like so painfully similar an experience that you could obviously tell that the author had direct experience with it, and that made the book better, and it made it feel less like just I don't know, re-traumatizing yourself or like making yourself feel really awful by reading a book that speaks directly to your experience, you know. I think it represents these things in a really deeply compassionate way, both in terms of Yoli's experience and also in terms of Elfrida. I think that's what I'm going to say about it. Oh, but I do also think that I will be picking up some more Miriam Toews, because after that, like, I don't know how you could not. I think I'm going to pick up A Complicated Kindness and also Fight Night, which came out more recently. So my next book is Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I did finally read in June, and I also loved. Finally, I really feel like I've been reading like some 5-star books in summertime or whatever, and yeah, so I loved it a lot. I'm not going to talk about it like anymore because I made a whole reading vlog where I did talk about like each book basically, but I just think it's great. It's a wonderful representation of humanity, and I really enjoyed immersing myself in the world, and I think that it's not too long. I think it's a great length, and I think that, you know, I'm also excited to read more of George Eliot's work. So yeah. The next book I read was another like Soviet history book, like fiction book, and that's Sophia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya, translated by Aline Worth, I think. And this is also about like a very similar experience as Requiem, or like it's about experiences from the same kind of time, so the late 30s into the 40s, of like the purges. We follow Sophia Petrovna, who's supposed to be a kind of like Russian every woman who gets a job working at a publishing company in like 1936, and then, you know, we follow what happens. She has a son and stuff happens to her son, and so she does a lot of this like waiting outside of prison buildings, just like in Requiem. So reading these two close together was really interesting and obviously pretty devastating too. It is like quite a short book. I would say it's a novella. I don't think it's really a novel, and I think that there is like a sense of caricature-ness to it, but I don't think that means it's bad. I think that's just part of like the storytelling. The only thing that I didn't like about it really was that there's some disabled characters, or specifically there's this like one man with a deformity, and the way he sort of comes to represent the like depravity of the Soviet regime basically, and I obviously didn't like that because like disabled people's bodies are not receptacles of national meaning, like or national violence. Like they're just they're just people's bodies, you know. They don't speak to some, I don't know, disgusting underside of power or corruption. And yeah, so I really didn't like that, but other than that it was interesting to read. I don't think it's a particularly successful book, like it, you know, I think I gave it like 3.5 stars or something, but you know, it was good and it was interesting to read as a document of historical record because it was written at the time. And what was really interesting was the postface that the author had written about the process of trying to get it published in Russia in Russian, and how that had been like stopped. And you know, originally in the late 60s after Stalin died and there was more like, we can criticize the regime, like share with us your problems, it was going to be published, and then they turned around, like the publishing company turned around and was like, no, we can't do it anymore, because there had then been this like pushback against people's like pushback against the regime, if that makes sense. And you know, so that was really interesting to read about. And again, it's a bit like with Anna Akhmatova, where I was like, I want to learn more about her life than necessarily enjoying reading her poetry. And the same with Lydia Chukovskaya, like I want to read more about her experience than her work. Although obviously, like I am still interested in her work. I'm not sure if there's anything else that's been translated into English, and I'm not even sure if she's written anything else, but you know, we'll see. The next book I read was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. Finally, I have read a Sally Rooney book and I felt like it was good. I picked it up because it's queer and I'm not really interested in normal people, and I actually think now that I've read it I'm going to read Beautiful World, Where Are You? I think I will like that probably quite a lot. But yeah, I'm actually like writing like a review, and I did think about making a video review of it, but I don't think I will, but of the book, because I think it's very interesting even if I don't like love it as a book. And I think the journey that Frances goes on is I like that, and I also think that the way that it plays around with, or is like thinking a bit about Marxism and about communism, is interesting, and also how it's thinking about Middlemarch, which is why it felt like a really perfect time for me to read actually, because I had just read Middlemarch and could really, you know, have been able to then really think about connections and comparisons between the two books. It's basically, in case you don't know, about like these four people, Nick and Melissa, who are a couple, like they're married, and Frances and Bobby, who previously were a couple but aren't anymore, now they're just best friends, and you know, like how they kind of orbit on each other and how they create new relationships between each other and fuck each other's life up and that kind of thing. And the last book I read, and I actually haven't finished a book for 2 weeks since this, because I think I finished this on like the 20th of June, but anyway, that's fine. This last book is Excellent Women by Barbara Pym, and I thought this was a very disappointing book. It's basically about a spinster, and you know, the term excellent women is like used to describe like sort of surplus women who do a lot of the like care work in communities, specifically like Christian religious communities, but also just generally like looking after people because they don't have a husband and they don't have kids. And it's like set in the late 40s, 50s, it's like post-war, and obviously like it's about a spinster woman. And on Actual Spinster we obviously read about spinsters, which is also I think why it was disappointing. And I'd also heard that Barbara Pym was like a good person in terms of like comparing her with Jane Austen and like blah blah blah, but I really didn't find that to be present in her writing or anything really. There was also like a lot of racist language because some of the characters are anthropologists, but they just use so much racism. It's like just so casual, it's horrid. And yeah, I also thought that the ending was honestly so deeply reactionary and conservative. I really hated it. Like it's not even like she gets any kind of benefit of love. She like just serves men for the rest of her life is basically what it seems to be suggesting, which I don't like. So yeah, really disappointing. But obviously I did have some really great reading happening, and then after reading that, I started like 8 books and I haven't finished any of them, so hopefully I'll finish some at some point soon. I think that's everything I had to say. Let me know if you've read any of these books or are interested in reading them or anything, and what your reading was like in the past 2 months. I also actually, my TBR jar, I can't quite remember, I think I also pulled out the poems by Anna Akhmatova, and also The Abyss Surrounds Us counted for it as well. I think maybe there was another one too. I mean, Middlemarch kind of technically counts as a book that like was on my TBR for a long time and would have been in the jar. I do feel like I made a bunch of progress with my TBR, so that's great. I hope you have a nice day when you're watching this, and I'll talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!